Just for the record, I do not have the right to put the game on the. Oral questions, question orale. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Monsieur le Président.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister said that state actors around the world, be they China or elsewhere or others, continue to act aggressively towards our institutions and our democracy. What kinds of aggressive games are they playing? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, whether it be Russian disinformation about what's happening in Ukraine, or Chinese interference in the diaspora and the media, whether it be the Iranian government putting pressure on Canadians of Iranian origin, we always remain vigilant to protect all Canadians from foreign interference. The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Met with the Chinese president and said he, quote, his office said he, quote, raised our serious concerns about interference activities in Canada. Was the Prime Minister ever briefed about any of these, and I quote, interference activities that he says, that the Prime Minister says went on in Canada?
Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I am regularly briefed by intelligence officials and security experts on threats to Canada and to Canadians, whether it be cyber threats, whether it be interference with Canadian diaspora communities, whether it be use of online misinformation or disinformation. There are a range of threats out there that Canadians and Canadian security agencies continue to be vigilant against. We will always be there to protect Canadians.
Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
What specific interference was the Prime Minister referring to when he raised his serious concerns about interference with the Chinese president?
The Honourable Prime Minister.
We've known for many years that there are consistent engagements by representatives of the Chinese government into Canadian communities with local media, reports of illicit Chinese police stations. These are all things that we continue to be concerned about, that our officials stay active on, and that we will continue to be vigilant around to keep Canadians safe.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
The Prime Minister continues to ignore the crisis that Canadian households are about to face with the skyrocketing home heating bills. They are expected to double in many communities. Some households will be stuck paying $5,000 to $6,000 a year, and yet he wants to not just maintain but triple, and then triple his carbon tax on Canadians. Now, he might play a game of delaying the implementation in a few provinces, but why wouldn't he take decisive action to reverse the damage he's caused to all Canadian and all of their homes by reversing the carbon tax on home heating altogether?
Here, here. The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Speaker, the price on pollution returns more money to the average families across the country than it costs them. It's a way of fighting climate change and putting more money in the pockets of Canadians. That's what Canadians in Atlantic Canada and elsewhere across the country are going to be able to benefit from. As we step up in the fight against climate change, we will be putting more money back in the pockets of Canadians that need it. Conservatives continue to spread misinformation and disinformation on that. We need to continue to be there for Canadians, and we will.
The Honourable Leader of the Opposition.
Our information comes from the man that he appointed as the Parliamentary Budget Officer, and that same official calculated that 60% of Canadians will pay more in carbon tax costs than they get back in any rebates. And that is even higher in provinces where the federally imposed but provincially administered tax does not come with any rebate at all. The Prime Minister wants to go further in increasing the costs of Canadians to drive, to eat, and to heat themselves throughout the very cold winter that's just ahead. Will he show some common sense and stop attacking the people on the ground like his minister and reverse the tax?
Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, Canadians from coast to coast to coast, but particularly in Atlantic Canada, where they saw the devastating impact of Hurricane Fiona, know that we have to continue in stepping up in our fight against climate change. And what we are doing, what we've been doing for years, is ensuring that while we fight climate change, we support families that actually need it. That's why the carbon price actually returns more money to the average families than they pay. And that's something that was confirmed by the Parliamentary Budget Officer. We will continue to be there to support Canadians while we fight climate change instead of peddling disinformation like the Conservatives.
Le député de la Prairie.
Quand on questionne le premier ministre sur l'ingérence.
When we ask about the Prime Minister about interference in the 2019 election, he blusters and compares us to Donald Trump, who's denying the result of the American presidential election. There's one person who spoke about the federal election in 2019, and it was the guy who won it. Chinese interference is very serious. To avoid it happening again, we need to know. He's got to stop posturing and tell us which candidates were funded by China, and above all, how did that happen? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, the integrity of our elections were not compromised. In January 2019, we set up a nonpartisan committee to assess threats to electoral integrity, and it was clearly established that the integrity of our elections had not been compromised in 2019 or in 2021. The Director of Elections said yesterday that nothing leads him to believe that there was any interference in terms of having a free and fair election. Instead of creating false concerns for Canadians, we want to reassure everyone about the integrity of our system. The Honourable Member for La Prairie. The Prime Minister is hard to follow with Chinese interference. On the one hand, he doesn't think it's important enough to respond seriously to the opposition, but at the G20, he was running around after the Chinese President Xi Jinping to talk about it. Here, he doesn't know anything about it, but at the G20, he was aware enough to go and discuss it with the Chinese president. So the question is, does he know all the details about Chinese interference and is hiding it from us? Or did he approach Xi Jinping solely based on a newspaper article? Either it's not honest or it's not smart. Where's the Prime Minister standing on this? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, the member from the Bloc Québécois is just saying whatever he wants. We know that it's important to protect Canadians from interference that exists from different countries. We know that full well. However, at the same time, we can confirm that in every briefing that I have had when it comes to security, our intelligence experts, and those who were monitoring our elections, we can confirm that the integrity of our elections was never called into question. The Honourable Member for Burnaby South.
And the Bank of Canada continued to attack high wages as a cause of inflation, when in reality, real wages have actually fallen. In fact, workers' share of GDP has also fallen. You know what hasn't fallen? The profits of large corporations. In fact, big grocery stores have seen profits increase by 118.3% since 2019. So when will this Prime Minister tackle corporate greed and protect families?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, building an economy that works for all Canadians has always been at the heart of what we've done as a government. That's why we raised taxes on the 1% so we could lower them for the middle class. It's why we introduced the Canada Child Benefit, which stopped sending child benefit checks to millionaires and instead sent more money to the families that actually need it. It's also why Budget 2022 included a temporary Canada Recovery Dividend and increases the corporate income tax rate on financial institutions permanently. We're making sure that corporations pay their fair share while we support Canadians.
Member for Burnaby South.
This Prime Minister can't even say the word profit, let alone take on the corporate greed of rich corporations. The response of the Bank of Canada so far has been to increase interest rates, and that's having a real impact on families. Families like Lauren Gilbert from BC, who shares that her monthly variable her mortgage has gone up by $1,000 a month. Many families like her are hurting. So when we know that the Bank of Canada sets the monetary policy, but the Government of Canada sets the fiscal policy. So when will this government tackle inflation so it doesn't hurt people?
Hear, hear. Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, as a government, we have stepped up to support people who need it the most through the pressures that we're facing because of inflation. Whether it was doubling the GST credit for 6 months, which puts hundreds of dollars more into the pockets of 11 million households across the country, whether it's moving forward on a $500 top-up to the Canada housing benefit to make sure that low-income families can pay rent, or making sure that low-income families and middle-income families who can't afford it can send their kids to the dentist. These are direct and concrete things that are helping Canadians get through these difficult times.
Before we go on to the next question, it's been great today, but I hear the odd lone voice. I'm sure that lone voice, whoever it is, doesn't want me to recognize them and embarrass their riding. The Honourable Member for Calgary, Forest Lawn.
This Prime Minister blew through a balanced budget left by the Conservatives, spending more than every Prime Minister before him combined. He's the architect of this inflationary mess. He made home heating bills almost double and was responsible for 1.5 million Canadians visiting a food bank in a single month. He left billions of dollars of good energy projects in the ground and killed pipelines. He's missed every emission reductions target, and emissions went up. Whatever the Prime Minister touches, he breaks. Will he acknowledge his failed record and stop forcing his failed carbon tax on struggling Canadians?
Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, by building an economy that works for all Canadians, we've seen not only millions of jobs created, but also millions of Canadians lifted out of poverty over the past years. Because we stepped up to support small businesses and families and communities and workers and seniors and youth during the pandemic with historic supports, our economy actually bounced back faster than many of our allies. We recovered full employment 6 months before the U.S. did following the pandemic. And we're continuing to be able to support families with direct initiatives that the Conservatives are opposing because that's what we're doing for Canadians.
For Calgary, Forest Lawn.
Mr. Speaker, this is coming from Canada's most notorious high-carbon hypocrite. He calls seniors and people on fixed incomes polluters while he jet sets around the world, singing in luxurious hotels, embarrassing Canada on the world stage on Canadians' dimes. There was always a price on pollution. We all pay our gas and electricity bills. What this Prime Minister did was create a scheme to take money from seniors and those most vulnerable to fill up government coffers, all in the name of climate change. Emissions keep going up, and the Prime Minister hasn't hit a single emissions reduction target. Just a simple question. Why do Canadians have to pay for this Prime Minister to pollute?
Before the Prime Minister answers, I just want to remind the honourable members, I know this is a passionate place, but please use parliamentary language, and calling each other names is not a good practice to have if we want to have civilized conversation and debate in the chamber. The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, unfortunately, personal attacks seem to be all the Conservative Party can deliver right now because they have no plan to fight climate change. They have no plan to reduce emissions. They have no plan to support Canadians who are struggling right now with the high costs of food and fuel and everything. They voted against our support for low-income families on rental. They voted against support for families to get their kids to the dentist. We will continue to step up for Canadians. We will continue to return more money into the pockets as we fight climate change, because you cannot have a plan for the future of the economy if you don't have a plan to fight climate change.
The Honourable Member for Thornhill.
Mr. Speaker, they're struggling because of this Prime Minister's tax hikes. Canadians are worried about how they're going to heat their home through the Canadian cold winter. The Liberals' response is that they're sick and tired of hearing people complain about the cold. The Minister of Labour said that yesterday. Instead of scrapping the carbon tax, which is making it more expensive for Canadians to eat, to drive, to heat themselves, they're tripling it. They could scrap the tax that hasn't reduced emissions, but instead they're imposing it on 3 more provinces that don't want it. Canadians are the ones that are sick and tired. Will he scrap his plan on the carbon tax?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, Conservative politicians seem to be the only people in Canada that don't think it's important to fight climate change. We move forward with a price on pollution to preventing pollution from being free anywhere in the country, while at the same time returning more money to the families who need that support in the provinces where the federal backstop applies. This is an approach that has both fought climate change and supported families, and we're pleased to see that positive impact extending to communities in Atlantic Canada as well.
For Thornhill.
Liberal politicians are the only ones that seem to think that this is working. While he launches into his misleading defense of the punishing tax, Canadians know that the carbon tax these Liberals keep hiking isn't an environment plan. He knows the parliamentary budget officer that he appointed told us that 60% of Canadians pay more than they will ever get back. His plan hasn't reduced emissions. He hasn't hit a single environmental target. So instead of punishing Canadians by tripling the carbon tax, why doesn't he give Canadians a fighting chance this winter and scrap it?
Right, Honourable Prime Minister.
Speaker, first of all, the parliamentary budget officer confirms that 8 out of 10 families receive more money back from this price on pollution than they pay into it. And at the same time, Mr. Speaker, every time the Conservatives talk about removing our price on pollution, what they're talking about is taking money out of the pockets of hardworking Canadian families, because the price on pollution puts more money in the pockets of average families across this country. That is how we both fight climate change and support families that need it. But speaking of support for families that need it, why are they opposed to dental and rental supports for Canadians? Why are they opposed to childcare that saves thousands?
Député de Louis Saint-Laurent.
Monsieur le Président, toutes les familles canadiennes.
Mr. Speaker, all Canadian families are facing the worst inflationary crisis in 40 years, and it directly affects an essential good, which is food. Lettuce is 30% more. Various foods are costing so much more. And the Liberals' response is to triple the Liberal carbon tax. Seriously, Mr. Speaker, could the Prime Minister get up and recognize that increasing this tax during an inflationary period is not good for Canadians? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, our price on pollution gives back to families who need it throughout the country. That's the reality that Conservatives are trying to avoid talking about. There are a lot of families who are struggling because of inflation, and that's why we are delivering a GST credit that's been doubled for 6 months and gives hundreds of dollars a month back to many households, and we're investing more into families to help families pay their rent and help pay dental care, but the Conservatives voted against those measures. The Honourable Member for Louis Saint-Laurent. The Prime Minister is not being entirely correct to not say that he is misleading the House. Since his return from COP27, this 15th ranked Prime Minister has been saying that the carbon tax is the right way to go, but that is not correct. Because what he's forgetting is that under his administration, Canada is 58th out of 63 countries when it comes to climate change. After 7 years of the Liberals imposing their climate change tax, this is the result they're getting. Could the Prime Minister get up and recognize that raising taxes during an inflationary period is really not a good thing for Canadians? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Our plan to reduce emissions is one of the most detailed in the world. We have a clear plan to prevent emissions from rising, and we are going to reduce them. We are looking for more sustainable sources of energy. This will help us to reduce our emissions and create more well-paid jobs. Measures to fight climate change must include support for workers, and I hope that I will have the support of the member for the opposition. The Honourable Member for La Prairie. Mr. Speaker, let's move on to solutions. 11 candidates received funding from China during the 2019 elections. It proves that we must fight against foreign interference in our democracy. And that's a good thing, because in this case, it's super easy. We just need to come back to public funding of political parties. We need to have Elections Canada fund parties based on the number of votes they receive instead of relying on large donors. We could do that tomorrow morning. Does the Prime Minister realize that as foreign interference increases, public funding is becoming essential? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, obviously, it's very important for all Canadians for our elections to not be compromised and maintain their integrity. That's why Canadians can be reassured by what the Director of Elections said yesterday, which was that nothing led him to believe that there was anything to undermine our free and fair election. In January 2019, we set up a nonpartisan committee to assess threats of interference in our elections, and that committee clearly established that the integrity of our elections had not been compromised in 2019 or in 2021. Canadians can maintain their trust. The Honourable Member for La Prairie. This is complicated. We can't resolve all misinformation campaigns on social media, for example, just by waving a magic wand. But illegal election financing could be eliminated tomorrow morning. We already knew that the dependence of political parties on private contributions made them vulnerable to influence by large donors. We now know that with Chinese interference in 2019, we have exactly the same problem with foreign powers. So let's kill two birds with one stone. Will the Prime Minister restore public funding for political parties? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, the member on the other side is talking about interference in the 2019 elections as though it were a fact. However, Canadians should not listen too closely because the General Director of Elections said that nothing led us to believe that the elections were not free or fair. Our nonpartisan committee assessed threats of interference in our elections and determined that the integrity of our elections was maintained in 2019 and in 2021. So let's not scare Canadians for nothing. Our institutions are strong.
The Honourable Member for Sherwood Park, Fort Saskatchewan.
55 Canadians were murdered when the Iranian regime's IRGC shot down flight PS752. After that, the Iranian government bulldozed the site, destroyed the evidence, and threatened and harassed family members of victims. Now we've learned that Canada's spy agency is actively investigating credible death threats against more Canadian citizens from this same regime. So when is enough going to be enough for this government? When will Liberals finally use the criminal code, list the IRGC as a terrorist organization, and shut down their operations in Canada?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Like all Canadians, we're appalled at the actions of the Iranian regime. We stand with the women of Iran. We are listing the Iranian regime under the most powerful provision of the Immigration and Refugee Protection Act. This measure has only been used in the most serious of circumstances, including against the Bosnian and Rwandan regimes. This punishes the top 50% of the entire regime, targeting those who are directly responsible for the heinous acts we are seeing and preventing them from ever being able to come to Canada. They are permanently barred from Canada. We will never be a safe haven for the Iranian regime's leadership or money.
Hear, hear. Well, member for Wellington, Halton Hills.
The allegations in the Globe story are false. That was what the Prime Minister's response to the Globe report, that he interfered in the criminal prosecution of SNC-Lavalin. I do not have any information, nor have I been briefed on any federal candidates receiving any money from China. That was the Prime Minister's response to the Global News report. The Prime Minister sows doubt when these kinds of reports are published. The best way to protect the integrity of a democracy is transparency. So when will the Prime Minister be transparent about all the facts concerning the 2019 election funding of candidates?
Hear, hear. The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
In all the extensive security briefings I have received, there has never been any information on federal candidates receiving money from China. We established a nonpartisan panel to evaluate any threats of election interference in January 2019, and they were clear that the integrity of our our elections was not compromised in either 2019 or 2021. And the Chief Electoral Officer just said yesterday that there is no reason to believe that it was not a free and fair election. Mr. Speaker, Canadians can be reassured that our election integrity held.
The honourable member for St. Albert, Edmonton.
Speaker, after 2 weeks of suspicious silence, the Prime Minister now suddenly claims that he was never briefed about candidates receiving money from Beijing. Yet Global News is reporting that last January, the Prime Minister received intelligence memos that Beijing's Toronto consulate directed the funneling of a large sum of money to 11 candidates in the 2019 election. So, did the Prime Minister receive those intelligence memos, yes or no?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Third time today, Mr. Speaker. In all the extensive security briefings I get, there was never any information given to me on candidates receiving money from China. So, no, Mr. Speaker. The reality is the integrity of our elections was not compromised. And people don't have to take my word for it. They can look at the independent panel we appointed to look at just that, or the elections officer, Canada Elections Officer, who just said yesterday that they were not compromised, our elections.
L'honorable député de Mégantic-L'Érable.
Le directeur général des élections a aussi dit hier.
The Chief Electoral Officer also said yesterday that it's not his role to investigate and follow up on complaints. Liberal MPs Logan Charlebois, Ottawa West Nepean, Whitby, Pickering, Uxbridge, who voted for the Conservative motion to investigate the allegations presented in the news on November 7th regarding the briefing that the Prime Minister would have received in January. Who's telling the truth here? Because from the beginning, since we've been listening to the Prime Minister, we really don't know what to believe or who to believe. The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Indeed, Mr. Speaker, the Chief Electoral Officer confirmed that nothing led him to believe that the last election was not free or fair. However, it's also true that it's not his job to investigate that. The nonpartisan committee that was created in 2019 to assess threats and interference in our democracy clearly established that the integrity of our elections had not been compromised in 2019 or 2021. And that is why I asked experts in intelligence and security to testify before committee and share all the information they could regarding elections.
Honourable member for Burnaby South.
We've learned that Canada has one of the worst records when it comes to fighting climate change, one of the best records for subsidizing oil and gas. That's bad news for the planet. When will this government eliminate subsidies for oil and gas, invest in renewable energy, and do what we have to do to protect the planet? The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
27, our government fought hard so that the world did not backslide on phasing out fossil fuel subsidies and coal, and reiterated our commitment to phase out fossil fuel subsidies within the next 2 years. We're taking real action to fight climate change, having already phased out 8 tax breaks for the sector and have committed to over $100 billion to climate action. While Conservative politicians want to make polluting free again, we will keep pushing forward on our ambitious and achievable plan.
The Honourable Member for Burnaby South.
When a company goes bankrupt in this country, financiers are sure they're going to get paid. Big banks get paid. But you know who doesn't? Workers, because they see their wages, their severance, their benefit, and their pensions stolen. And the reason that is because the laws of this land protect the super wealthy and hurt workers. Despite years and years of an opportunity to fix this, this Liberal government has refused to do so. So my question is very direct and very simple. When will this Prime Minister change the laws in this country so that if a bankruptcy happens, workers are protected?
Hear, hear. Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, we've always been there to protect pensioners and workers, unlike Conservative politicians who continue to push for CPP and EI cuts. We will support Bill C-228, but we will take no lessons from a Conservative Party that waged war on Labour for a decade and has nothing to offer Canadians but bitcoins and buzzwords.
The Honourable Member for Aurora, Oak Ridges, Richmond Hill.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In fact, the official opposition leader's solution of investing in volatile crypto as a means to opt out of inflation is reckless. If Canadians had followed his advice, their life savings would now be decimated. In fact, the Ontario Teachers' Pension Plan just said it will have to write off its $95 million investment in FTX, the crypto exchange that collapsed last week. Is the Prime Minister aware of any alternative, responsible policies to make life more affordable for Canadians?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the member for Aurora, Oak Ridges, Richmond Hill for her question, because I'd like to raise a viable alternative to fighting inflation. Two specific responsible measures will be implemented thanks to the recent passage of Bill C-31. Help for Canadians to pay for their rent and support for their children to be able to receive proper dental care. Mr. Speaker, while the Conservatives think Bitcoin and buzzwords will solve inflation, on this side, we'll always stand on the side of supporting the middle class.
I just want to make sure everybody's calm, and I noticed, I won't mention the Honourable Member, but he's sitting right next to the person who's asking a question. I'm sure he's not going to say anything while the answer is coming back to her, so that the Honourable Member for Kildonan and St. Paul can hear the answer that comes back. The Honourable Member for Kildonan and St. Paul.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Canada has seen a 92% increase in gang-related homicides since this Liberal government took office. There were 124,000 more violent crimes last year than when this Prime Minister took office in 2015. That's things like rape and assault and stabbings, Mr. Speaker. Everything these Liberals have done for public safety has failed and made Canada a less safe place to live, Mr. Speaker. So when will this Prime Minister finally step up and get tough on crime?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
We have frozen the market on handgun ownership. We are fighting gun smuggling and trafficking by investing yet another $137 million for CBSA in this year's fall economic statement. And our new legislation will also help revoke licenses for people who've been charged with domestic violence or stalking. These are evidence-based measures that will save lives. And while we're fighting to make our communities safer, the Conservative Party is fighting to make assault weapons legal again.
The Honourable Member for Kildonan St. Paul.
Mr. Speaker, this Liberal government's record speaks for itself. They are failing to keep Canadians safe, and violent crime doesn't just happen. It's from failed Liberal policies. It's things like the Liberals' Bill C-5, which ends mandatory prison time for serious gun offenses, things like robbery with a firearm, extortion with a firearm, firing a gun with the intent to hit someone with the bullet, Mr. Speaker. No longer mandatory prison time under this Prime Minister. Now that criminal can serve house arrest in the comfort of his home. That's their approach to solving violent crime in this country, Mr. Speaker. It is ridiculous, and it's endangering Canadian lives. When are they going to smarten up and get tough on crime and clean up our streets, Mr. Speaker?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Speaker, we have now passed legislation to address the overrepresentation of Black Canadians and Indigenous peoples in the criminal justice system. What Canadians deserve is legislation that goes after criminals while protecting our communities and holds up in court, which is where the Conservative Party's tough on crime approach consistently failed to protect Canadians that way. If it's being struck down by the courts, it's not protecting communities. So we will not follow Conservatives' failed approach that doesn't protect Canadians and violates people's fundamental rights.
The Honourable Member for Charlebourg, Haute-Saint-Charles. Mr. Speaker, the mayor of Laval is asking for help to fight against armed violence in Sorel. And at the same time, StatsCan has confirmed that murders in Canada and street gang crimes are at their highest level since this Prime Minister took power in 2015. Meanwhile, the Liberals, with the help of their friends from the Bloc and the NDP, voted together to eliminate mandatory minimum sentences for armed robbery with a firearm. The Prime Minister prefers to let criminals go free instead of protecting Canadians. Why? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, we've frozen the market for handguns. We are fighting smuggling, and we've invested $137 million additional dollars in the CBSA in the fall economic statement. And our new legislative measures will also facilitate taking away licenses from those who are accused of violence or harassment. These are measures that are going to save lives. We are working to make communities safer, while the Conservative Party is fighting to make assault weapons legal again. The Honourable Member for Charles-River-Saint-Charles. Mr. Speaker, there are so many things that are said in this House that are completely false. But what we're seeing right now is that violent crimes are up 32%. And the police in Montreal said that there were 144 shootings in Montreal in 2021. That's one every 3 days. And that's taking place with illegal weapons. It's been said that our border is full of holes, and getting an illegal weapon is easier than it's ever been in Canada, Mr. Speaker. This government is spending billions to fight against honest citizens. Why aren't they spending the same money to fight criminals and gangs? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. With Bill C-21, we are fighting against assault weapons, so all new weapons will be automatically classified as they are created. We are investing in communities in Canada. We are strengthening our borders, and we have caught more than 2 times the number of illegal weapons last year than we did the year before, and we're giving more tools to our forces of law and order to protect our communities. Meanwhile, the Conservatives want assault weapons to be legal again, but we are determined to keep communities safe. The Honourable Member for Repentigny. Mr. Speaker, I've just come back from COP27 on climate change. The Prime Minister's main allies were there, like Joe Biden, for example, or Emmanuel Macron. There were over 100 leaders who were there. Everyone was there except the Prime Minister of Canada. Where was he? Where was he, Mr. Speaker? How is it possible that between November 6th and 20th, he wasn't even able to find just half a day to show up at COP27 to discuss climate change with the rest of the planet? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, our plan to reduce emissions is one of the most detailed in the world. We have a clear plan to prevent emissions from going up, and we are going to reduce them. We are making our energy more sustainable than ever. We're investing in technology that is going to help us reduce our emissions and create more well-paying jobs. We're going to continue with that work, and the Minister of the Environment, who represented Canada well at COP27, presented an approach which brought the world together. The Honourable Member for Repentigny. As Prime Minister of a G7 country, he had a golden opportunity at COP to talk about climate change. But not only did he not take that opportunity, he left it to the oil and gas companies. He invited 6 oil sands companies to sing their own praises at a climate change summit. He even mandated his environment minister to defend the oil and gas sector by preventing COP from including in its final declaration that we need to reduce our consumption of oil and gas. So, at the end of the day, did the Prime Minister boycott COP to avoid having to justify his record before the cameras? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Member knows very well that we were very well represented at COP27 by our Minister of the Environment, who worked very hard to bring the world together around a progressive plan. But at the same time, Mr. Speaker, I was at the G20 summit and at other important summits where every day I raised the importance of climate change leadership. We've showed that Canada is there not only at COP, but at all the major forums around the world to continue to fight climate change.
The honourable member for Coast of Bay Central Notre Dame.
Mr. Speaker, yesterday the Minister of Labour from Newfoundland and Labrador declared that he's sick and tired of people talking about the cold winter. The people he represents are sick and tired of trying to make ends meet as fuel costs skyrocket. Yet this tone-deaf minister brags about the virtues of the failed Liberal carbon tax plan. When will this Liberal government show some compassion and cancel their plan to put carbon tax on Atlantic Canadian home heating?
Honourable Prime Minister.
What Canadians need is a plan that puts more money in their pockets, and that's exactly what the price on pollution does. While conservatives twist words and misrepresent what people say, we're going to stay focused on what Canadians are actually saying, that they need help. And that's why we're delivering help with a price on pollution that puts more money in their pockets, with support for dental and rental that conservatives are voting against. We're going to continue to be there to reduce childcare costs. We're going to continue to be there to support Canadians, while conservatives have nothing to say about fighting climate change, nothing to say about growing the economy and helping Canadians.
Member for Coast of Bay Central Notre Dame.
Mr. Speaker, I'd like to remind the member for Papineau that he's a servant, not the master. Here's what the masters have to say, Mr. Speaker. A VOCM poll out today asked, with fuel costs already high, do you feel a federal carbon tax is necessary? The result? 91% said no. So in light of the opinions of Newfoundlanders and Labradorians, will the minister apologize for yesterday's comments, and will he plead with his Liberal colleagues to cancel their plan to push the carbon tax down the throats of Atlantic Canadians?
The Right Honourable Prime
Mr.
Minister.
Speaker, a few weeks ago, I stood in the street in Port aux Basques and held in my arms a woman who...
I'm getting a look from the Deputy Whip, but he's not hearing the yelling that's going on right in front of me. I just want to hear the answer, and I'm sure everyone else does as well. So, the Right Honourable Prime Minister, from the top, please.
Mr. Speaker, a number of weeks ago, I stood in the street in Port aux Basques and held in my arms a woman who'd seen her house destroyed by Hurricane Fiona. People in Newfoundland and Labrador, and indeed across Atlantic Canada, know, unlike conservative politicians, that climate change is real. And we need to do everything we can to fight against it while supporting hardworking families. That's why, unlike what the conservative politicians say, we're making sure that pollution is not free anywhere across the country, and we're putting more money in the pockets of hardworking families in Newfoundland and Labrador and elsewhere.
The Honourable Member for South Shore St. Margaret's.
I tell you what's real, this government has missed every climate change target they set. And meanwhile, the Liberal minister from Newfoundland says that it's good news that we have a carbon tax. These shameless Liberals think that it's good news that gas will increase 14 cents a litre. They think it's good news that home heating will increase 17 cents a litre. Any more of this Liberal good news, and food bank usage will go up triple from now. So I ask all those silent Nova Scotia MPs, will they stand up and ask to scrap the failed carbon tax?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Speaker, Atlantic Canadians know that we need to fight climate change. So yes, Mr. Speaker, it is good news that we have a strong price on pollution right across the country. And it's even better news that that price on pollution puts more money back in the pockets of hardworking families who need it as we fight climate change. It is impossible to have a plan to grow the economy without having a plan to fight climate change. But all conservative politicians are offering is a lot of hot air, a lot of criticism, a lot of misinformation, but no solutions to support families or fight climate change.
The Honourable Member for Laval-Les-Îles. Mr. Speaker, as we all know, the Indo-Pacific region is of critical importance to Canada, particularly when it comes to economic growth and economic resilience. Strengthening Canada's presence in the region means creating new economic opportunities and good jobs for Canadians. Can the Prime Minister please tell more to this House and Canadians about our government's historic investments to expand Canada's presence in the Indo-Pacific region? Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Right Honourable Prime Minister. Mr. Speaker, I'd like to thank the member for Laval-Les-Îles for his question and for his hard work. Last week, we announced a number of investments, particularly $750 million for infrastructure projects, sustainable quality projects in developing countries, and $45 million for a number of trade missions under Team Canada. We've also we'll be launching our Indo-Pacific strategy in the coming weeks, and we will continue to strengthen our presence in the region and create good jobs on both sides of the Pacific.
The Honourable Member for Foothills.
Parliamentary Budget Officer said tripling the carbon tax will do little to reduce emissions in agriculture. Why? Because we're already amongst the most efficient in the world. What the carbon tax will do will punish farmers with more than $1 billion in additional costs. And now the NDP Liberal Carbon Tax Coalition wants to expand that punishing tax to include Eastern Atlantic Canadian farmers. Emissions from agriculture in Canada are 70% lower than the global average. So why is the Prime Minister punishing Canadian farmers for that incredible achievement instead of praising them?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Speaker, 80% of families in areas where the federal carbon price backstop applies get more money from the price on pollution. That is true for Atlantic Canada. That is true right across the country. On top of it, rural and remote Canadians, like farmers, are able to benefit from a 10% top-up to the climate action incentive that comes to them 4 times a year. These are the things that make sure that we can both fight climate change by ensuring that pollution is no longer free anywhere in the country, while we directly support the hardworking families that need that support.
Member for Foothills.
Prime Minister should read his own legislation. The farm tax rebate through C8 gives farmers pennies on the dollar back on what they spend in the carbon tax. Right. The result of that, Saskatchewan farmers just had the most expensive harvest in their history. Their on-farm costs exceeded $11 billion, the highest year-over-year increase since 2012. On-farm fuel has more than doubled. The cost of fertilizer is up 110%. The carbon tax is pounding farmers to the ground and putting our food security at risk. What will it take for the Prime Minister to cancel his plan to triple the tax on food, fuel, and farmers?
The Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, from the supply chain disruptions of the pandemic to the war on Ukraine, there have been global disruptions that have impacted Canadians, including Canadian farm families. At the same time, however, putting a price on pollution not only prepares and ensures that we're ready to be competitive in a lower carbon world in the coming decades, it also puts more money back in the pockets of hardworking families that need it every single year. This is the approach that both fights climate change to ensure a better future for our kids and grandkids, while at the same time supporting families right now. We will continue to be there for families.
Honourable Member for Lethbridge.
While the Prime Minister has no problem spending $6,000 of taxpayer money on one single hotel night, Canadians are struggling just to feed their families. Thanks to these Liberals, everything in this country is broken. 1.5 million Canadians access a food bank in a single month. Inflation is at a 40-year high, and over half of all Canadians are living paycheck to paycheck, finding it difficult to make ends meet. So the question is simple. When will the Liberals stop making life difficult for Canadians and actually give them control of their lives?
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Speaker, I've spoken about the dental and rental supports that'll make a real difference in Canadian families' lives immediately that Conservatives voted against. But I haven't spoken yet today about the childcare initiatives that we put forward. Reducing childcare to $10 a day, cutting childcare fees in half for Canadian families right across the country this year is saving them thousands of dollars at a time where indeed pennies are tight for everyone. Unfortunately, Unfortunately, Mr. Speaker, the Conservative Party continues to oppose childcare, continues to oppose rental and dental supports. We're going to be there for Canadians while they leave people behind.
Honourable member for Vaughan Woodbridge.
Mr. Speaker, it is very clear that harsh and ineffective policies from the previous Conservative government did not succeed in making our communities safer, while also contributing to the overrepresentation of Indigenous people, as well as racialized and marginalized Canadians in our justice system. Can the Prime Minister inform the Chamber of the concrete steps we are taking to move past those policies and adopt a better working approach to making our justice system accessible, efficient, and fair? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Right Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, I want to thank the member for Vaughan Woodbridge for his question and the hard work he does for his constituents. I'm proud that Bill C-5 has now received royal assent. It is a long overdue and essential step for our criminal justice system. It'll give the judges the flexibility to impose sentences that fit the crime and contribute to address the over-incarceration of Indigenous, Black, and racialized people. We believe in a justice system that is tough when it needs to be tough, but is always fair.
The Honourable Member for Burnaby South.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The genocide against Indigenous women, girls, and 2S LGBTQIA plus people is ongoing and only getting worse as violence increases. Despite their promises, the government hasn't taken action. The last budget has no investments to help Indigenous women and girls, and funds meant to build shelters have been left unused. The Prime Minister must show leadership to keep his government's promises. So what is this Prime Minister going to do to accelerate the implementation of all calls for justice?
Honourable Prime Minister.
Speaker, over the past number of years, we've invested historic amounts in supporting the fight against gender-based violence across this country, in support for 2S LGBTQI plus communities, in support for Indigenous housing and Indigenous-led solutions. We know there is always much more to do, but this government will continue to be a partner on the road to reconciliation, showing up with real investments, showing up with capacity building, showing up to keep Indigenous people safe and looking towards a brighter future.
The Honourable Member for Richmond, Arthabaska. Mr. Speaker, Francophones across the country are unanimous when it comes to Bill C-13. The coordination of the implementation of the Official Languages Act must be confided to one single entity, the Treasury Board. The Liberal government agreed in its white book in 2021, or white paper rather, in 2021. However, this isn't the case in Bill C-13 in its current form. Can the Prime Minister please confirm to all Francophone Canadians that this essential element will be included in the bill, as has been asked for by every organization that defends Francophones in Canada? The Right Honourable Prime Minister. I'd like to thank the member for his question. I share his concern when it comes to protecting our official languages. In Bill C-13, we are strengthening the Treasury Board's powers when it comes to official languages. This bill is the result of a lot of hard work that started in 2018, and consultations were undertaken with Canadians across the country. C-13 is currently at committee stage, where unfortunately the Conservatives and the Bloc Québécois are blocking debate. We hope that they will stop playing political games and will start to look at very important amendments so that we can protect French from coast to coast to coast.
C'est tout le temps que nous avons pour la...
That's all the time we have today for question periods.
Draw the attention of members to the presence in the gallery of the Honourable Tammy Scott Wallace, Minister responsible for Women's Equality and Minister of Tourism, Heritage and Culture for the province of New Brunswick.
The Honourable Member for Shefford is rising on a point of order.